This is the Prince of Darkness, the father of lies. This is the great enemy of both God and man. This is the horned one, the winged one, crowned in flame. This is temptation, pride, and fear. This is Pantheon mythology, and this is why is Satan so terrifying. If you too want to be crowned in flame, check out Pantheon Apparel, our clothing brand inspired by mythology, legends, and folklore. We ship worldwide and we're rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. Before Satan became the horned deceiver or ruler of hell, he was something far more ambiguous. In early Judaism, there was no singular figure called Satan. Instead, there was Ha-Satan, a title, not a name. It simply meant the adversary or the accuser, and it wasn't always referring to the same being. The clearest example comes from the work of Job. Here, Ha-Satan appears not as a rebel or enemy of God, but as part of the divine council, a kind of celestial prosecutor. He moves among the sons of God and speaks directly with the Lord. When he challenges Job's piety, it isn't rebellion, it's investigation. And it happens with God's full approval. He is there to test, to probe, to accuse, not to destroy righteousness, but to prove it. The idea of an adversarial figure acting under divine authority is consistent with other early Jewish texts. In number 22, for example, the angel who blocks Balaam's path is referred to as Satan, an obstacle, an opposer. Again, it's not a name and it's not evil. It's a role, one that can be filled with different beings, depending on the context. This sharply contrasts with how other ancient religions viewed cosmic adversaries. In Zoroastrianism, Angra Mainyu was the eternal enemy of the good god Ahura Mazda. In Mesopotamian myth, gods of chaos like Tiamat had to be slain to create order, but in early Judaism, there was no opposing force equal to God. There was no devil waiting in the shadows. Evil existed, yes, but it was not personified in a single being. The terrifying thing about Satan today is that he's imagined as an autonomous, malevolent will bent on humanity's destruction. But in these earliest texts, there was no such threat. There was only an adversary fulfilling a divine task, and that task was to challenge. Something shifted during the Babylonian exile. When the people of Judah were taken into Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE, they weren't just stripped of their homeland, they were immersed in a culture steeped in cosmic dualism. Zoroastrian thought, which dominated Persian religion, presented the world as a battlefield between two opposing forces, one good and one evil, light and dark, order and chaos, locked in eternal conflict. While early Judaism had no such dualism, the experience of exile began to change things. The old view of a sovereign God with complete control over both good and evil was harder to reconcile in a world where temples lay in ruins and suffering seemed endless. The need to explain evil, injustice, and the persistence of suffering opened the door to new ideas. The concept of an autonomous antagonistic force, something more than a role, more than a test, began to take root. Not yet Satan as we know him, but the soil was being prepared. Later Jewish texts from this period, like 1 Enoch, begin to describe fallen angels, rebellious spirits, and cosmic corruption. Evil was no longer just human disobedience or divine punishment, it was something other, something active, something adversarial. Not a direct adoption of Zoroastrian theology, but the influence is undeniable. The exile created a moment of theological crisis, and into that crisis came the beginnings of a cosmic enemy. A force not just allowed by God, but standing in defiance of him. The first faint outlines of a Satan who wasn't part of God's court, but opposed it. The shift from challenger to enemy didn't happen all at once. It took centuries, and it began with a line of poetry. In Isaiah 14:12, the prophet mocks a fallen king of Babylon with the words, "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn." In Hebrew, the phrase is Hallel ben Sahar, a reference to the planet Venus, the bright star that rises in the morning but quickly fades. It was a metaphor for pride and collapse, aimed squarely at a mortal ruler. But centuries later, when the Bible was translated into Latin, Hallel became Lucifer, meaning light bringer, and over time, this poetic insult was reinterpreted as a historical event, the fall of an angel from heaven. This is where the idea of Lucifer as a name begins to take hold. What was once symbolic becomes literal. Readers and theologians started to link this morning star with the devil himself, and Lucifer became a pre-fall identity, the beautiful angel who, through pride, defied God and was cast down. But this wasn't the only thread feeding the transformation. In the intertestamental period between the writing of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, a new kind of religious literature emerged, apocalyptic, visionary, and cosmic in scale. Among the most influential was 1 Enoch, a text that tells the story of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth, took human wives, and taught forbidden knowledge to mankind. These angels corrupted the world, introduced violence and sorcery, and were ultimately punished by God for their rebellion. While 1 Enoch doesn't refer to these beings as Satan, it introduced a radical idea, that evil could begin in heaven. The divine beings could fall, and that some forces might not just test humanity, but actively seek to destroy it. This blurred the lines between angel, demon, and adversary. Over time, these threads began to weave together. The poetic fall of the morning star, the rebellion of the Watchers, the adversary from Job, and slowly the Satan transformed. He stopped being a function and became a figure. No longer a servant of divine justice, but a challenger to it. No longer the accuser in God's court, but the enemy outside its gates. By the time Christian theology began to take shape, Satan was no longer just an obstacle or a tester. He had become a rebel, a traitor, the great opposer of heaven itself, the prince of a kingdom not of order, but of chaos, the light-bringer turned dark. Across mythologies, evil isn't just something that happens, it's something that waits. Whether it's Loki sowing chaos in Asgard, Apophis threatening the sun in Egypt, or Mara whispering illusions beneath the Bodhi tree, there is often a single figure blamed for the unraveling of order. These beings don't just cause destruction, they represent it. They give evil a shape, a voice, a face. Satan fits this pattern. By the time his transformation into a rebel was complete, he was no longer just a figure in a handful of verses. He was something bigger. The villain of the cosmic story, the one who corrupts, tempts, destroys, and in doing so helps define what is good by showing what stands against it. This is the deeper function of personification. It makes evil knowable, containable. A snake in the garden is easier to fear than a formless sense of doubt. A horned deceiver is easier to blame than the human capacity for violence, greed, or cruelty. And once a culture gives evil a name, that name becomes powerful. It can be invoked, feared, accused, or worshipped. It becomes a tool, not just for storytelling, but for control, for identity, for meaning. Satan wasn't the first to wear that role, but in the Western tradition he became the most enduring version of it. Not just a fallen angel, but a mythic constant, the thing behind the mask, the evil behind the evil. But not everyone agreed on who the villain really was. In the early centuries of Christianity, a series of sects known collectively as the Gnostics began rethinking the story entirely. For them, the world wasn't created by a perfect, benevolent God. It was created by the demiurge, a flawed, arrogant being who fashioned the material world out of ignorance or spite, not love. He believed himself to be the highest power, but above him was a hidden, greater divinity, a true God, unreachable by ordinary worship. In this worldview, the Garden of Eden wasn't a paradise, it was a prison. And the serpent? Not a deceiver, but a liberator, the one who offered humanity knowledge and truth. Some Gnostic texts even associate this figure with Satan, not as a corrupter, but as a revealer. In their eyes, Satan wasn't terrifying because he was evil. He was terrifying because he disrupted the illusion. He showed that the divine order might not be divine at all, and that the God who demanded obedience might not be worthy of it. That the world people were told to trust was, in fact, the lie. Mainstream Christianity would reject Gnosticism as hearsay, but the fear it provoked was different, and in some ways deeper. Not the fear of sin or damnation, but the fear that everything you believe might be upside down, that the villain might be the hero, that salvation might not come through obedience, but rebellion. In that inversion, Satan becomes something more disturbing than a monster. He becomes the one who tells you the truth. By the time of the New Testament, Satan was no longer a function or a symbol, he was a force. He appears in the wilderness to tempt Jesus directly. He possesses, manipulates, and accuses. In 1 Peter, he prowls like a roaring lion waiting to devour. In Revelation, he becomes the dragon, the deceiver of nations, cast down from heaven and destined for destruction. The quiet adversary of the Hebrew Bible had become an all-consuming threat, personal, cosmic, and apocalyptic. But that fear didn't stay in Scripture. It bled into the pulpits, the cathedrals, the paintings, and the laws. In the medieval imagination, Satan took new forms shaped by a world obsessed with order and terrified of what lay outside it. He became horned, goat-like, blackened, twisted, part man, part beast, all warning. He ruled hell, not as a place of rebellion, but as a prison of torment, a necessary counterpart to heaven, where the disobedient were sent to suffer forever. This version of Satan served a purpose. He was a deterrent, a theological weapon. When the church warned of damnation, it wasn't about sin, it was about him, about falling into his grip, about becoming one of his. And so he was everywhere, on walls, in sermons, in nightmares, always watching, always waiting, always ready to claim the unworthy. But then, in the early modern period, something changed. Satan stepped onto a different stage, one not built by priests, but by poets. In Paradise Lost, John Milton reimagined the devil not as a beast, but as a tragic hero, proud, intelligent, noble in defiance. This Satan doesn't twist arms or torment souls. He speaks with conviction. He mourns what he's lost. He chooses exile over obedience, and in doing so, he becomes far more dangerous, because now he's relatable. This was the devil not as a nightmare, but as a mirror. Theologians continued to preach hellfire, but literature had complicated the image, and what followed was a fragmentation. In some corners, Satan remained the monstrous torturer of medieval hell. In others, he became the rebel, the freedom seeker, the one who dared to challenge power. Across 2,000 years, Satan wore many faces, but one spoke to a particular fear: the fear of temptation, the fear of punishment, the fear of chaos, the fear of questioning authority. From scripture to sculpture, he adapted, because to stay terrifying, the devil had to evolve, and he did. Fear, once created, is rarely left unused. As the image of Satan solidified from cosmic rebel to monstrous torturer, he became more than a religious figure. He became leverage. The Church didn't just warn of sin, it warned of him, of his hands reaching for your soul, of his presence in your thoughts, and in time that fear stopped being about the devil himself and started being about control. During the witch hunts of early modern Europe, accusations of satanic pacts didn't require proof, only suspicion. Women who lived alone, healers, midwives, the poor, the outspoken, the strange, to deviate from social norms was to risk being branded a witch, a heretic, a servant of the devil. Torture was justified, execution was sanctified, all in the name of rooting out his influence. The Inquisitions turned this fear into doctrine. To question authority was to flirt with damnation. To challenge the Church was to conspire knowingly or not with Satan himself. And so his name was invoked again and again, not as a myth, not as a metaphor, but as a justification for violence, persecution, and silence. But even centuries later, in a world supposedly more rational, the pattern persisted. In the 1980s, whispers of satanic cults, ritual abuse, and demonic influence gripped schools, churches, and courts. There was no evidence, there were no devils, but there was fear, and that was enough. The satanic panic was a modern inquisition, dressed in new clothes. The devil didn't need to appear, he only needed to be named. Because Satan is the perfect enforcer. He needs no chains, no crown, no miracles, just belief. Once people fear him, they can be shaped, controlled, divided. And in that sense, the most terrifying thing about Satan might not be what he is, but how easily he is used. Not all Satans are the same. The devil of Catholic Europe, the horned beast, the punisher, the enemy of God, is only one face among many. Across the Christian world, Satan has been imagined differently. And each version reveals not just who people feared, but what they feared most. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Satan isn't a powerful rival to God, he's a pathetic one, a creature broken by pride, pitiful in his downfall. But that doesn't make him less frightening. His terror comes from what he represents, the soul cut off from light, twisted by its own rebellion, unable to return. He's a warning not of destruction, but of ruin. In folk traditions, especially in rural Christian Europe, Satan often shrinks. He's not cosmic, he's local. A trickster at the crossroads, a whisper in the woods. He appears in disguise, tempts with promise, dances with fools, and while he's sometimes outwitted, the fear he brings is subtler. He's the fear of being led astray before you even know you've wandered. And then there's a devil in modern pop culture, no longer just a villain. He's sometimes the protagonist, the suave rebel, the charismatic outsider, the one who dares to ask forbidden questions. This Satan terrifies not through punishment, but through persuasion. He makes evil look reasonable, makes defiant feel righteous, and that's a different kind of danger entirely. Each one of these Satans reflects a different anxiety, about sin, about deception, about control, about doubt. But whatever shape he takes, whatever name he wears, one thing stays the same. He stands just outside the light, watching, waiting, close enough to tempt, but never close enough to trust. In the modern world, belief in Satan is fading. Secularization has stripped him of much of his theological weight. In many places, the devil is no longer preached from pulpits or feared in nightmares. He's dismissed, doubted, even laughed at. But he never really disappears. Instead, Satan shifts again, leaving the altar for the screen, the sermon for the stage. He survives in horror films, black metal, comic books, and video games. He becomes a meme, a symbol, a brand. His horns are even sold on Halloween shelves. His name headlines festivals. His image, once burned into stained glass, now flashes in neon and pixels. He endures not as doctrine, but as icon, a cultural echo, a rebellion you can wear, a joke with too much weight behind it. He is summoned for shock, invoked for irony, and performed for profit. But even in these playful forms, the old unease remains, the sense that behind the grin is something older, something darker, something still watching. The devil no longer needs a church. He has the internet. He has pop culture. He has us. Satan terrifies not just because of what he is, but because of what he reflects. Psychologist Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of the self we repress, deny, and bury. The rage we're told not to feel, the desire we're taught to fear, the thoughts we'd never say out loud, and if that shadow grows large enough, it doesn't vanish. It surfaces, usually in stories, in symbols, in myths, in figures like Satan. Because what is he, if not everything we're told to push down? Pride, lust, anger, rebellion, chaos, freedom. Not just evil for its own sake, but the terrifying possibility of choosing the forbidden and enjoying it. He isn't just the tempter, he's the temptation, and that's why he lasts. We fear Satan because he wears our face, just twisted, unleashed, and unashamed. He whispers not just lies, but truths we're afraid to admit. That we're not as pure as we pretend, that some part of us still hungers, that if God represents the ideal, Satan represents the real. He's the villain of Scripture, but he's also the reflection in the dark glass, the one we pretend not to recognize. So then, why is Satan so terrifying? Because we speak of him in stories, laugh at him in films, and deny him in public, while living by every principle he ever stood for. Because the world no longer needs a devil with horns when we celebrate the very things he was cast out for: vanity, power, indulgence, and pride. Because if his goal was never worship but influence, then we're already in his kingdom. And we built it ourselves.